I had first met Liza when I went with Cher to a party at Halston's. In 1979, I met her again. She was playing a few nights at Radio City Music Hall. I had no romantic aspirations, and I certainly didn't think of getting into Liza Minnelli's business. We became friends and would go to dinner occasionally. Liza, Judy Garland's daughter, had been a star of stage and screen for decades. Whenever we got together, our conversation would turn to music. Liza would ask about Kiss. She wanted me to explain to her how it had all happened, how we had gone from obscurity to worldwide fame. I explained that it wasn't just one person. It was a huge confluence of record labels and management. She said there was nothing Madonna had that she didn't have, except for the right songs. I basically told her the lay of the land as I saw it. The Ethel Merman style of singing, with a wide vibrato, was a thing of the past. It wasn't going to fly. The average teenage girl didn't know a thing about that world. If she was interested in letting go of her past and recreating Liza Minnelli, then I could help her out. I became her music business manager. I took her to Columbia Records and introduced her to Walter Yetnikoff. He gave us the green light right away. He didn't waste time looking at bottom lines or consulting with vice presidents. He was a classic mogul. A young A&R guy named Michael Goldstone came up with an idea to put Liza with the Pet Shop Boys and do a modern Euro disco album. I explained this to Liza and told her what it would require. As I got more and more involved in Liza's recording career, we were seen together. Some of the gossip magazines started reporting, "Kiss star captures Liza's heart," which wasn't the case at all. Liza and I had a totally professional relationship. I would meet with her at her apartment, and then we would meet at the Fifth Avenue penthouse where I lived. We talked endlessly about movies, music, and her aspirations to break into the pop field. I enjoyed her company. I enjoyed going to events with her, like the grand opening of the first Hard Rock Cafe. I respected her as an artist, and I wanted to help her with her career. But that was all I wanted. The single she cut with the Pet Shop Boys was a huge international record. In America it didn't sell, but it gave her something more important: momentum. At that time, Dean Martin had fallen out of a tour he had undertaken with Sammy Davis Jr. and Frank Sinatra. Liza joined that show, and in the middle of it, she played 23 shows at Radio City Music Hall, straight. That must be some kind of record. 6,500 people for 3 weeks straight. I wasn't the only one who liked Frank Sinatra. When I started working with Liza, Peter Criss kept telling me how much he loved him. I contacted his road manager, who got me front row tickets to see Sinatra in Los Angeles. Sinatra looked at us and winked. Peter was in heaven. He had just gotten the Good Housekeeping seal of approval from the chairman of the board. Liza had her ups and downs in life. Just as I was starting my own record company, Simmons Records, she and I decided to part ways. She wanted to go back full into the high-stepping and belting tradition of singing. I wasn't in favor of it. I thought people would think she was just putting on a mask as a modern pop singer. She couldn't break free of Broadway. To some people that may have been important stuff. To the record-buying public, it meant nothing. In the end, we couldn't make it work. I met with Mickey Rudin, one of the top lawyers in the entertainment business, and we dissolved our agreement. Around the same time Liza left my life, Neil Bogart, the president of our label, and the man who had helped us so much in our early years, who had supported us as we rocketed to fame, was stricken with cancer. One night, I went to a music industry charity event at the Hilton in New York City. I was sitting with Neil, who had become very puffy, and I was joking with him, telling him, "I love pastries too." I didn't realize he was sick. My heart sank when I realized later on that the physical changes had to do with the illness. A few years later, our business manager called and said, "Would you like to go to the funeral?" "What funeral?" Well, he said, Neil Bogart just passed away. We flew out to Los Angeles and stood there, numb, while everybody from Neil Diamond to Donna Summer delivered eulogies. He was clearly well loved by lots of people. Astonishingly, his son, Timothy Bogart, wrote a script I'm now producing for a movie. Life seems to go in circles. By 1983, Kiss had dropped Ace Frehley and then Vinnie Vincent. We had gone from the biggest band in the world to a band seemingly on its last legs. We ultimately brought in another guitarist, Mark St. John, for Animalize, but he lasted for only one record. He developed something called Rider's Syndrome, a hardening of the muscles in the hands. They blew up to the size of balloons, so obviously he couldn't play. The Rider's Syndrome had started to accelerate during the making of the record, and we were worried. But Mark insisted that it wouldn't affect him. We actually started a tour with him and played a smaller hall in Poughkeepsie, New York. It was clear from that show that his medical problem was significant, and that he wasn't the right guitarist for Kiss. Paul and I decided to produce Animalize ourselves. After we finished the basic tracks, and I finished my vocals, I told Paul I would trust him to finish the album. He wasn't pleased. But I had a film opportunity I didn't want to pass up, so Paul ended up doing the work. I had wanted to act in movies for a long time. It dated back to my earliest interests, which were oriented more towards science fiction and fantasy films than to music. Whenever I saw movies, I read the credits. On one film it said that the casting directors were a firm named Fenton and Feinberg. I called the operator and found out where Fenton and Feinberg were. I didn't even know their first names. I called them up and said, "Hi, I'm Gene Simmons from Kiss. Can I come in and talk with you?" "Sure," Mike Fenton said. We set a time, and I showed up for my appointment and immediately announced, "I'd like to be in movies." Just like that. I didn't see the point in wasting time with a big wind-up. Mike Fenton called Michael Crichton, the director, who was a novelist and a screenwriter, and who would go on to write Jurassic Park and Twister and to create ER, and within 30 seconds, they had offered me a job. Actually, I had to pass one small screen test. Michael Crichton turned to me and asked me to do something strange. "Look me in the eyes," he said, "and don't make any expression. Don't grimace. Don't contort your face. And without saying anything, convey with your look that you're going to tear our hearts out." I stared at him with murder in my heart, and it seemed to work. I got a co-starring part in Runaway starring Tom Selleck. I hadn't even read the script. I was told that I would be playing the villain. On the first day of the shoot in Vancouver, the part called for me to walk up and ring a doorbell and say a line. I was supposed to pretend I was a repairman coming to fix something. I was supposed to communicate a certain untrustworthiness and threat. I read my line, and then afterward Michael Crichton yelled, "Cut!" I walked over to Crichton and said, "Look, I really apologize. I'll do anything you want me to do. I'm so sorry I messed it up. What did I do wrong?" No, he said. "Let me explain something to you. In movies, if the director says cut and you move on to another scene, that means good. If I say let's do it again, that's bad." Movies had a completely different dynamic than rock and roll. It was like pulling teeth. You sit around for 16 hours a day. The only thing I could do was try to figure out which of the female extras I'd like to take home that night. There were always interesting-looking girls on the side, and I'd be flying in girls left and right from California. It was a busy time, and also an interesting time, because I met a whole new group of people and tried many new things. Kirstie Alley played my girlfriend. I got to stick a knife through her neck in the movie. That made me a real likable fellow. I tried coming on to the actress Cynthia Rhodes. That didn't work out. So I tried her sister. That didn't work out either. So I went for one of the extras on the set, a real knockout of a Canadian girl. That worked. If at first you don't succeed. When I was in Los Angeles on one occasion, I hooked up with Stan Brooks, who was working with the Goober Peters Film Company. I had first met him in 1981 during the Grotus experience. He introduced me to Jeff Loeb and Matt Weissman, and at the Beverly Hills Hotel, we came up with an idea that would eventually become Commando, a breakout film for Arnold Schwarzenegger. It was going to be a starring role for me. But when I showed the script to Michael Rackmill, who was the producer of Runaway, he dissuaded me. I believed him and I let it go. I later revisited the script with the intention of trying to have someone else take a look at it, but it was too late. Producer Joel Silver had bought it, and it was being made. That was the last time I would let someone else decide for me what worked and what didn't. In 1984, during the making of Runaway, I would have enough time off during weekends that I could fly into Los Angeles and run around to the parties. The best parties were at the Playboy Mansion, especially the Midsummer Night's Dream parties, which were big summer bashes with hundreds of girls in corsets and underwear and a select group of eligible bachelors. Guys were not allowed in unless they were dressed in pajamas, and girls had to wear as little as possible. The ratio was something like 400 girls to 100 guys. That's how Hugh Hefner liked his parties. At this point, Diana and I had adjusted our relationship. We were still together, but we had our freedom. Before the party, I told her that I was going up to the Playboy Mansion and that I was planning on flirting and having a good time. At the party, I spent some time, and made some time, with a few gorgeous women. And then I ran into Richard Perry, a record producer I knew who had produced everybody from Rod Stewart to the Pointer Sisters. Perry introduced me to a girl named Shannon Tweed and her sister Tracy Tweed. Both of them wore stiletto heels and corsets, and both of them were formidable, well over 6 feet tall. You can imagine the effect. I was devastated by Shannon in particular, and did everything to try to woo her. We talked for a while. At first she wasn't interested, but after a while she came back around to talk with me. Then she took me to the library, where a secret door behind a bookcase opened into a passage that led to a wine cellar below. She sat down on a table in there, and I remembered thinking this was clearly an invitation. But 5 minutes went by without any sex, and then 10 minutes. I remember just being lost in conversation with her. She came from Newfoundland in Canada, and I came from Israel. And we started talking about the strangeness of America and how we both felt like fish out of water. After that we went upstairs, not having fully consummated our first meeting. On the way out she gave me her number and said, "Call me." After meeting Shannon, I lost interest in the other new friends I had made that night, including Miss February. I went back to the Beverly Hills Hotel, and all that night and the next morning I tried calling the number. She had given me a wrong number. A guy answered. He'd never heard of Shannon Tweed. I couldn't figure it out. Eventually I decided that I had been taken for a ride. Then, as I was watching television in my single room at the hotel, I saw a photo being pushed under my door. I got up and looked at the photo. It was a black and white headshot of Shannon. Then I looked on the back, and there was a handwritten note. "I've never been so insulted," it said. "If you took my number, why didn't you call me? Next time be a man and don't start something you're not going to finish." It was that kind of letter. And on the bottom it said, "If you still have the guts, here's the phone number." The number was different from the number she had given me the day before, only 1 digit different, but that's enough. I called her up immediately and said, "I say what I mean and mean what I say, and you gave me the wrong number." "The wrong number?" she said. "Don't you think I know my own phone number?" "I'm just saying that the last number is different," I said. She was angry at first, and eventually she relented. I went over to see her and was overtaken with passion and lust. I thrust my hand under her sweater and then kissed her deeply. She didn't seem to mind, and we became acquainted very quickly. Soon after that, I called up Diana to tell her about Shannon. I didn't want her to hear about it from the tabloids. I explained to her that I had met this girl and wanted to spend some time with her and see how that relationship went. She wished me the best and told me she hoped I was happy. Diana has always had the grace and class that I wish all women had. About 3 weeks later, Diana and I spoke again. Right off, she asked, "Are you still with Shannon Tweed?" I said yes. I wasn't sure where the conversation was going. Then Diana dropped a bombshell. "You know," she said, "she's my sister-in-law." Unbeknownst to me, Shannon's sister, Tracy, had secretly married Diana Ross's brother, Chico. Soon enough, I moved into Shannon's Los Angeles apartment. She was everything I never knew I wanted in a girl. She had her own career. She had acted on television shows and starred in dozens of movies. She didn't seem to want anything from me, and she was drop-dead gorgeous. Although I didn't know it at the time, Shannon had just come out of a relationship with Hugh Hefner and had lived at the Playboy Mansion with him. She'd wanted a career, and he wanted her there, so she moved out. She had also graced the covers of Playboy a number of times, and her portrait hung, I'm sure, on many walls around the country. As soon as we met, I told her everything. I told her I never wanted to get married, to her or anyone else, ever. I told her I never wanted to have children. I told her I was afraid of commitments, of any kind, and that I wanted to be free to pursue my ambitions, whatever they may be, without having to check in with someone. She was okay with all of it. In fact, she said she wanted the same thing for herself. I was hooked. I told her my philosophy, that I'd found the whole idea of marriage and commitment to be faulty at best, and in my opinion, obsolete and impractical. A major thing wrong with marriage is that traditionally one of the two getting married is a man, and men aren't cut out for marriage. A second problem is that someone other than the one who gave birth to you, your mother, is going to dominate you. My mother stopped asking me where I was going, who I was seeing, and when I was coming home decades ago. I would be damned if I let anyone else ever have that right. Despite my posturings, I was scared. Shannon disarmed me because everything about her was so honest. There were no games, no hidden agendas. If that isn't enough, Shannon was and continues to be the most striking woman I've ever seen in my life. I wanted us to work. I also wanted to feel safe. I wanted everything. I wanted the goddess, and I didn't want to have to grow up just yet. So at first, I lived with her in her apartment. I didn't want to plant my roots too deeply. And by the end of the first year, I learned how to drive at the age of 34. I bought my first car, a Rolls-Royce, and decided to buy a place to live with Shannon. I bought a home on 2 acres in Beverly Hills and paid cash. Though I was falling for Shannon more deeply every day, I was still cautious. I had read too many horror stories of relationships turning ugly, lawyers, alimony, lawsuits. I wanted no part of it. I would rather live alone for the rest of my life than have anyone dominate me or in any way expect payment for having shared my bed. That seemed to be the way everyone else lived their lives. People got married, then they got divorced and hated each other. Statistically, marriage doesn't work. Divorce often happens within a few years of marriage, at a rate as high as 75% in some parts of the country. Men are miserable, women are miserable, and both are trapped. When a couple splits up, often the man has to pay his ex-wife 50% of what he makes, before taxes, which is lunacy. The highest tax rate around is 48%, and in return the government gives you the armed forces, free schools, Social Security, and nationwide infrastructure. Your ex-wife gives you a few years of companionship for her 50%. My mother gave me life, and she's not getting 50%. It seems to me to be a lose-lose proposition. When a man marries a woman, he promises to stay with her and support her until he's 6 feet under, and he's not supposed to be attracted to or be with another woman for the rest of his life, from his 20s, say, until his death. He takes this oath in front of God, his wife, and all assembled. Everyone lies about their ability to fulfill these promises, but they go through with it anyway, and when the marriage is over, a man had better be able to reach deep in his pockets. Who invented this system, the devil? Despite my strong feelings about marriage, I still wanted to make a relationship with Shannon work. To say my life changed drastically when I bought that Beverly Hills house is to put it mildly. I had never had a driver's license before. You don't need one in New York. Taxis are everywhere, and if you have a car, you need a lot of luck finding a space to park it in, and you never know if the car will be there the next morning. I had a tennis court in California, but I'd never played tennis. I had a swimming pool, and although I could swim, I never went swimming. Between tours, my sleeping habits changed. Where once I had a lot more in common with nocturnal creatures, now I had a beautiful 6-foot playmate to wake up next to, someone I wanted to bring breakfast in bed to, someone I cared about. My neighbor next door was Donna Mills. On the other side, Kate Jackson. A few doors down lived Cher. Later on, everyone sold and moved away. I stayed. I liked it. I felt I was home for the first time. This level of intimacy made me want to share everything with Shannon. I started talking about everything, about how I was straight, had never been drunk, and that I had chased a skirt or two in my day. I even told her about the photographs. I had always felt, if I had been with a girl, I wanted a picture of the experience. I had had literally a few thousand liaisons, and had taken photos of almost all the ladies. I told her she needed to know about me, no secrets. I remember putting all the pictures on the table and letting her go through them. She couldn't believe it. She didn't understand it. But most important, she wasn't judgmental. She's always been like that, as long as I can remember. I don't know much about Shannon's life until we started living together. I didn't read Playboy, although I had obviously seen the magazine at friends' homes. I wasn't aware until she showed me how many times she'd been on the cover and inside. Perhaps some men would have a problem with millions of others looking at nude photographs of the woman they were with. But I was actually proud of the fact. Nudity to me isn't an issue. Violence and drugs are. As far as I'm concerned, if everyone had more sex, there would be less violence. Shannon was the girl of my dreams. She kept getting more and more beautiful. She never asked me where I was going. She never asked me when I was coming back. When we were away from each other, I would call her every day without fail. Not because I had to, or because it was expected. That would never have worked for me. I did it because I wanted to. Trial by Fire. A Death in the Kiss Family. 1985 to 1993. The year 1985 saw us solidify Kiss, with the lineup consisting of Bruce Kulick, Eric Carr, Paul, and myself. We had another platinum seller with Asylum, and we were doing it all without makeup and without the original lineup. We'd had new business management who had taken over Bill Aucoin's duties from '82 on, and that relationship had run its course as well. We let them go and hired Larry Mazer as a consultant. We were hesitant to employ new managers. They wanted too much money. So for all intents and purposes, we were self-managed. At this time, Runaway came out, to generally favorable reviews, and I immediately got another movie offer. Wanted Dead or Alive was to be directed by Gary Sherman and would star Rutger Hauer. I was slated to play the villain. When I arrived on the set the first day of shooting, I was introduced to the crew and to Rutger. He came over, shook my hand, and right there in front of everyone took my face in his hands and kissed me full on the mouth. The crew laughed their heads off. I was stunned. I enjoyed working on the movie, but my film career was really starting to irritate Paul and management. They wondered if I wanted to stay in the band or go for an acting career. The answer was that I wanted it all, but that wasn't entirely fair to Paul, who was committed to Kiss full-time. I acted in another movie called Never Too Young to Die. This time I played two roles, one as a CIA agent, and the other as his alter ego, a transvestite rock star named Ragnar. I wore stiletto heels and a bra with a corset attached. I wore women's makeup. I wore fishnet stockings. I looked like an evil painted woman. One day, after I had gotten into my full getup, I started to teeter my way onto the set. Along the way I passed the trucking crew, who promptly ripped me a new asshole. "Hey, Gene, looking good. Hey, what are you doing later, baby?" I hated it. During one of the scenes, I had to mouth an old Wayne County line. "It takes a man like me to be a woman like me." My backup band were real transvestites who gave me tips on how to be convincing. The movie also starred John Stamos and Vanity, who enjoyed flirting with me as much as I enjoyed flirting back. Then in 1986 I was offered a film called Red Surf. The cast included Dee Dee Pfeiffer, Michelle's sister, and George Clooney. I played a Vietnam vet who has had his fill of killing. At the end of the movie I had to come and save everyone from certain death. I was getting accustomed to the movie business. I was living in California with Shannon, while the rest of the band was in New York. Eric was working out just great on drums, and the whole touring environment was stress-free for the first time now that Ace and Peter were no longer in the band. By 1987, Kiss had gone through a series of guitarists. We had brought in Bruce Kulick in '84. In an odd coincidence, Bruce was the brother of Bob Kulick, who had auditioned for Kiss in its inception. While Bruce lacked a personal style, he was quite accomplished and was willing to reproduce Ace's solos from the records. Bruce has always been a professional, and being in the band with him was a joy. Initially, he lacked a certain stage presence, but though he was sensitive about his shortcomings, he was willing to work to become a better stage performer. Paul was looking for other ways to express himself, including acting. He would later go on to star in the stage version of Phantom of the Opera and close the show after 150 performances in Toronto. Then he decided to put together a solo band, the Paul Stanley Band, and go out on his own tour. His band consisted of Bob Kulick on guitar and a drummer named Eric Singer. I went to see Paul perform and sat up in the balcony with Eric Carr. It was interesting, actually, watching Paul from the audience instead of standing next to him on stage. Eric Carr was concerned he would be replaced by Eric Singer, who was a terrific drummer and singer. At the end of Paul's tour, the two of us turned our attention back to Kiss. We were now making more money than we had even in the glory days of the '70s. Gone were the excesses of management perks, inefficient stage designs, and expensive recording sessions. In 1989, I found an inexpensive demo studio, and we recorded our next album, Hot in the Shade, there. It was done for a fraction of the usual costs, with no producer fees involved. We produced it ourselves. Paul wrote a song with Michael Bolton called Forever that made it into the top 10, and the ensuing tour was a big success. We had a 40-foot-high sphinx in the center of the stage, and we appeared in the mouth as the eyes were shooting flames and fog came out of the nose. With or without makeup, Kiss was selling out concerts again. Life has given me the opportunity to take advantage of my whims, at least to the point where I can get doors open. One day I was sitting around thinking of other projects that interested me, and it suddenly occurred to me that I would like to have a record label. I had always taken an interest in younger bands. If there was a Geffen Records, I thought, why couldn't there be a Simmons record? At the time, the RCA label didn't really have a strong rock and roll presence. which seemed unfortunate to me. It had been the home of Elvis Presley. RCA seemed like a promise unfulfilled. As usual, I didn't bother with lawyers or complicated proposal letters. I just got on the telephone and called Bob Buziak, the president of RCA. I didn't get him. Instead, I got Heinz Henn, the European head who had seen Kiss in several German shows. Henn, Buziak, and I met, exchanged views and philosophies, and before I knew it, I had a record label, Simmons Records. The first album my label released was a self-titled debut by a band named House of Lords, which featured a guy named Greg Giuffria. He had been in a band named Angel that had signed to Casablanca Records on my recommendation, and then after that he had a band named Giuffria that had a big hit in the mid-'80s, a song called Call to the Heart. I signed Greg only on the condition that I would executive produce his record. I would have full control over the name, the look, everything. I didn't want the name to be Giuffria. I wanted them to be House of Lords, which was a name I owned and had trademarked. I wanted to direct their image. That record went to #1 on the UK import chart before it was ever released in the United States. Other bands followed, including a California rock band called Silent Rage. But the original concept got a bit blurred over time. For example, a band called Gypsy Rose was an act that RCA found. I didn't have anything to do with it, but they wanted me to put it out on my label for credibility purposes. I also courted Joe Walsh for a solo record and was managing, producing, and writing for many artists. I was still in Kiss, and even if I wasn't devoting my full attention to the band, I knew it had to remain a top priority. Pretty soon it became clear to me that there just wasn't enough hours in the day for me to manage my own label. When the time came, RCA didn't pick up the option, and Simmons Records disappeared. As I write this book, though, I'm talking to several major labels about reviving Simmons Records. During the summer break from the Hot in the Shade tour, I came back to L.A. and to Shannon. I had it all. Kiss was doing well. I was living with a queen. What else could I want? I was about to find out. One evening, Shannon and I went to the Neil Bogart Memorial Cancer Fund event, which was being held at the Santa Monica racetrack. I was talking to Sherry Lansing and Joyce Bogart, and the conversation turned to marriage. I mentioned how scared I was of marriage. Well, Joyce said, "What about kids?" And before I could utter a word, Shannon said, in a voice just above a whisper, "I'm pregnant." I didn't hear her say it, not consciously. I heard the words, but they never connected with my brain. I never thought I would ever hear those words from anyone. I remember feeling dizzy as the blood rushed to my head. Before I knew it, Shannon and I were alone and facing each other. Everyone else had left us. I didn't say anything. I was holding my breath. So here it was, finally, the day I never thought would happen. What was I going to do? Would I accept my responsibility? More important, was this something that I might have wanted all along, but never had the courage to admit to myself? I looked into Shannon's eyes and saw that this was something she really wanted. I can't tell you why, but at that instant, I knew I wanted the same thing. I wanted to be a father. It wasn't the notion, well, this is supposed to happen. I just knew it deep inside. Over the course of her pregnancy, Shannon became quite voluptuous and even more desirable. She was sexy and curvaceous. I couldn't keep my hands off her. As the pregnancy went along, we joked that she needed a suit of armor to protect her from me. I had become something of an expert at keeping my emotions under control. Suddenly, pure white fear started to creep in. Oh my God, I thought. There's going to be a baby. Is it going to be a boy or a girl? And, oh my God, what if it's a girl? How do I talk to a girl? All these things that I never verbalized, that I never even dared think of, were suddenly upon me. I was a wreck. I have to say, Shannon had a little morning sickness. It was nothing out of the ordinary for a pregnant woman, but for me, it was all out of the ordinary, and I was very concerned about her and the baby. Kiss went on tour to Europe, and I took Shannon along. It was the first time I had taken a girl on tour with me. I tried to explain what touring was about. She saw girls lifting their tops during the shows. She answered the phones when the girls would call. She was a good sport about it. When we were in London to play Wembley Stadium, I saw a girl I may have had a liaison with, I can't recall. I mentioned this to Shannon, who was now visibly pregnant. The girl followed me around, and one day I answered the front door to find her standing there. With Shannon in the background, she offered to kick Shannon's stomach to kill the baby. She ran off when she heard Shannon coming. When we came back to America, we went to see a doctor. At one point, he asked if we wanted to know the sex of the baby. We did, so they set up an ultrasound machine to look into Shannon to actually see the outline of the baby. This was about a month before the birth. I thought I was watching a science fiction movie, with the baby inside, moving. "So," the doctor said, "I suppose you'd want to know that you're going to have a boy." "Well, yeah, sure, I can tell." I thought that he was going to be the most well-endowed son on the face of the planet. But it turns out that what I was looking at was the umbilical cord. The thing looked longer than his leg, which in fact it was. But what did I know about umbilical cords? I just wanted the best for my son. Finally, Shannon went into labor in the middle of the night. We got into the car, and I drove her to the hospital. It was all very calm. We had taken Lamaze classes and knew that we were supposed to control labor with breathing, not rush to the hospital in a panic, but take it slow and easy. When she went into the delivery room, it was for a labor that lasted about 23 hours. Every once in a while, I'd go into the room and feed Shannon some ice cubes. We've always joked around a lot, so while she was in pain, she'd say, "Don't ever touch me again. Don't you ever put your hands on me again. Look what you've done." The jokes would soon die away because the pain would come back. I was there for every second of that birth. I watched the birth happen. I was the first person to see the crown of my son's head appear. I was the first person who held my son. When my son first opened his eyes, he saw me. I was the first thing he saw. I cut the umbilical cord. You have to cut it twice, once in the middle and once up close. Nicholas Adam Tweed Simmons was born at 8 pounds, 11 ounces. Aside from a man's own birth and death, I would have to say the birth of his child is probably the pivotal point in his life. Emotions were running like crazy. I felt like I was on a roller coaster ride. I don't know if I ever blinked my eyes, but I have the sense that I didn't. I wanted to keep all my senses wide open so I could record this moment, which I never imagined would ever happen. There I was, holding in my arms a real live human being who was looking at me, and who was going to be looking to me for everything, for life, for sustenance, for knowledge. I was going to have to be there. They talk about the maternal instinct, but there's a paternal instinct too, I'm sure. A man came toward me, and I heard these soothing words. "All right, Gene, that's the doctor. He's going to take the baby and clean him up." While I understood the words intellectually, I emotionally didn't want to let my baby go. I kept repeating this to my son, to Shannon, to the doctor. I didn't want to let him go. I remember resolving that if it came to it, I would fight to the death. It was like when guys fight on the street, when you're fighting to the death, when an animal's cornered, fists aren't even an issue. I had a picture in my mind of completely enveloping the doctor with my legs and arms and sinking my teeth into his neck. I would cut his jugular and kill him where he stood because he was taking my son. To this day I have a mental picture of that poor innocent doctor in his death throes. He's drowning in his own blood, with his jugular completely torn apart, and my face is covered with his blood. I had never felt anything like that before in my life. I didn't understand that kind of rage. I remember Shannon saying something like, "Gene, it's okay." I must have had my eyes wide open and my nostrils flaring. I gave up my son to the doctor, but what they did next seemed like torture. They took Nicholas's finger and stuck it with something sharp so it bled. I wanted to kill the nurse, even after she explained to me that they were testing for clotting factors. Then they stuck a tube down his nose and his throat to get all the liquids. They put things in his eyes. They circumcised him. Then it was all over. I don't know that I slept at all for 2 or 3 days. I must have stayed awake around the clock, just watching Nicholas. He kept looking at me. I felt a little inadequate. As a man, all I knew how to do was make money and chase skirt. And all of a sudden, here was a baby who was now depending on me for everything. Was I doing it right? Who knew? What do you do when a baby poops in your hand as you're holding him? Do you put him down? Do you wipe? Help! That's all I remember saying for many weeks. The months went by, and the first word he said was, "Daddy." I remember my knees buckling. I thought about taking all my credit cards and saying, "Here, it's all yours. Just keep saying Daddy." I never thought I'd ever hear those words from anybody. It's true that I lived with Cher's children and Diana's children, but they were at ages where they could take care of themselves. Here, instead, were the challenges of real fatherhood, and for me there was an additional challenge. Would I be like my own father, or would I stick around and do what I was supposed to do? In my mind, but most important in my heart, there was never any question. Nicholas was a dream baby. When he'd cry in the middle of the night, I would jump up and run to him. Not that I would necessarily know what the hell to do when I got there. One afternoon between tours, Shannon was changing his diaper and she called to me to come in and help. I rushed in and she asked me to take over. I grabbed both sides of the diaper as if I were a skilled surgeon and was admiring the fact that my son was defying gravity with his appendage even at such an early age. I remember smiling as I leaned over to close the diaper when Nick let me have it straight in the face. I caught Shannon laughing in the other room. She had timed it just right. When he turned 2, I arranged for a full petting zoo to be brought over and set up on the tennis court. There were more kids and parents there than I had ever seen assembled in one place. Besides all the ducks, rabbits, and rams, there was a miniature horse. Nick was helped on and took his first ride. I had to wait until I was about 7 to get dressed up as a cowboy back in Israel. I never got a chance then to ride a horse. My son would beat me to it by the time he was 2. I was reliving my childhood through my son. I was able to speak English, Hungarian, and Hebrew, as well as some German and a few Japanese phrases. I had a BA in education and had taught 6th grade. I was a self-made man, and yet I found Shannon had a sort of life wisdom I never even contemplated. For one thing, prior to becoming a father, I never really imagined wanting children. After becoming a father, I couldn't imagine not wanting children. Shannon seemed to know this about me. She never questioned my decisions about not wanting marriage or children, but she didn't seem as shocked as I was at how much I loved being a father. At an early age, my mother used to tell me, "I would throw myself in front of that truck for you." I never knew what she meant by that. Why would she want to do that? Later I found myself telling Nicholas the same phrase. I'm sure he thought the same thing I had. By Nick's 2nd year, he slept with us in a 6.5-foot wide, 7-foot long, gigantic bed. The accepted wisdom was to let your child sleep alone. We didn't care. We wanted to be together 24 hours a day. California was everything New York wasn't. The weather was paradise, and people seemed nicer. I'm reminded of the New York joke that goes, "A man from California visits New York and asks the first gentleman he meets, "Excuse me, sir, is this the way to the Empire State Building, or should I just go fuck myself?" I was to find out that Paradise had its problems as well. Late one night, the silence was shattered by a 6.7 earthquake that shook Los Angeles within a 150-mile radius. It literally shook like a carnival ride. I immediately jumped up and grabbed Nicholas, and with Shannon running behind, we first stood in the doorway of the bedroom, and then ran down the stairs that were shaking and swinging. Luckily, the house was not damaged much, but when we watched the news, it looked as if Los Angeles had been in a war zone. I wasn't the only one who was feeling the pull of domesticity. A few years later, Paul met Pam Bowen and soon decided to marry her. The wedding was to be held at the Bel Air Hotel. Before the event, I racked my brain for a present. I just couldn't figure out what to get Paul to show him how much he meant to me. I was the best man, and at the wedding I was scared stiff. It wasn't my wedding, but it was close enough. Afterward, we went inside for food and music. Guests got up and wished Paul and Pam all the best. At one point, I grabbed the microphone and asked Paul for his permission to do something out of the ordinary. Then I parted the curtain and gave the stagehands a nod. They brought out a large television set. I stuck a cassette into the video machine, and there was Tony Bennett, holding a champagne glass in his hand. He toasted the couple, sang "To the Good Life," and wished Paul and Pam all the happiness in the world. I had called Tony Bennett, and he was kind enough to make all this happen. A kinder and classier guy doesn't exist. It was an era of good feeling, a time when emotional bonds were solidifying, and new life seemed to be blooming everywhere. Maybe it was inevitable then that the happiness would be counterbalanced by some sadness. When we got off tour, Eric Carr called me and told me that he had woken up one morning coughing blood. The very thought sent a chill up my spine. He was immediately placed in the hospital, where doctors found a growth on his heart. They told him that he would need emergency open-heart surgery. Paul and I immediately flew to New York to be with Eric the night before the operation. When I walked into his room, he was in great spirits, alert and joking. We offered to get him anything he wanted. He asked for a McDonald's hamburger and fries, which was what he practically lived on while we were touring. We brought back the food, and we all joked together before we left. A few days later, we visited Eric in the hospital again. All had gone well, he said. The doctors were happy with the results. Paul and I felt relieved. What we didn't know, what Eric wasn't telling us, was that he had cancer. Fairly quickly, he became very ill. He lost all his hair, his huge Italian afro, and it broke our hearts. We were getting ready to record an album that we planned to call Revenge, and Paul and I decided that although we would pay for all of Eric's medical expenses and do whatever we could to help him fight his illness, we needed to start our album. At least for a time, that meant replacing him with a studio drummer. We tried our best to explain, but I'm sure it still hurt him. By early 1991, we had decided to give Bob Ezrin another shot at producing. We still felt that Destroyer was one of the strongest albums we'd ever made, and while we weren't sure Bob was up to it, especially after the bad experience of The Elder, we were interested enough to do one song with him as a kind of test. The producers of the film Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure needed a song for their soundtrack, and they wanted us to record God Gave Rock and Roll to You. Bob, Paul, and I rewrote the lyrics and re-recorded the song, which went into the top 10 in England. That was reason enough to stick with Bob for a full record. Since Eric Carr was still sick, we went through another round of drum auditions. After we failed to find the right drummer, Paul suggested Eric Singer for the album and brought him on for a few months. Eric Singer was a very funny guy, completely professional. We were not planning to bring him into the band, since we were hoping for Eric Carr's recovery. When it came time to shoot the video for God Gave Rock and Roll to You, Eric Carr begged to be in the video, even though he hadn't played on the recording. We were concerned about whether he was healthy enough or strong enough to do it, but we agreed. Eric showed up and stayed until the very end of the video shoot, which lasted until 3 in the morning. He never complained, not once. I believed that he could somehow turn things around. It was not to be. During the recordings of Revenge in 1991, Eric Carr passed away. We were devastated and flew to New York for the funeral. Ace showed up as well to pay his respects. We said hello to each other, but sat in different parts of the church. The fans lined the driveway leading up to the church, and everyone was in tears. The fans had loved Eric, and they weren't the only ones. It devastated everybody. Whether Ace cared for Paul or myself at that point, nobody can say. But he always felt very close to Eric. The biggest concern that Eric Carr ever had was that Peter Criss might have hated him for taking his place in the band. He didn't want Peter to think that he usurped him on purpose, or that he didn't respect what Peter had contributed to the band. When he first met Peter, he said, "I'm so sorry." It stopped Peter in his tracks. I think he had expected to be defensive around Eric, to try to size him up and convince himself that Eric wasn't as good a drummer as he was. But he was completely taken aback by Eric's kindness. Peter speaks fondly of him even today. Saddened, sobered, we resumed work on Revenge. One evening I went to see a group I had produced, Easy O, perform in a club. Vinnie Vincent came up to me and apologized for causing the band so much grief while he was a member. He wanted to patch things up and wondered if I would consider writing some songs with him. Sure, I said. I wanted to let bygones be bygones. I called Paul and told him that Vinnie had apparently changed. Paul wrote songs with him as well, and before the album was released, Vinnie was up to his old tricks again. He reneged on a signed deal we had made and decided that he wanted to renegotiate. He eventually sued us and lost. As far as I was concerned, he was persona non grata forever. Away from us, he didn't exactly thrive. He formed a band called the Vinnie Vincent Invasion and signed to Chrysalis Records, but he managed only a couple of records before he was dropped. Actually, the band as a whole wasn't dropped. Chrysalis re-signed everyone else and renamed the band Slaughter, who then went on to achieve platinum sales. Vinnie then signed a deal with Enigma, but no record was ever released. People at the label told me that he had erased his own master tapes because he didn't think the material was good enough. He may have been right. In 1992, Revenge came out and did well, going gold. We wanted to go back on tour with Eric Singer and did a series of club dates to introduce him to our faithful fans. Then we went out on a very successful arena tour. The stage show featured a Statue of Liberty motif. We felt as if Seattle and the grunge bands had killed rock and roll. There was so much bad press for any band that got up on stage to put up a straight show. Grunge killed off the marketplace entirely. There were no lights, no costumes, and by the millions, white kids went over to rap, because bands looked like bums. At least rappers were talking about girls and money. A decade later, the grunge bands are dead, and the hair bands that they knocked off the map are back with successful summer package tours. Shannon got pregnant again, and this time it was a girl. By then I'd become a full-time father. I had bought roller skates, taken my son for ice cream, and passed on my knowledge. I have pictures of myself as a baby, and Nicholas as a baby, and we look like twins. He was a miniature version of me, and in some ways, that made the experience easier to handle psychologically. But how would I handle a little girl? How did little girls think? I had so many worries, but all of them evaporated the minute I saw Sophie. I was smitten immediately. She tilted her head to one side, and I was gone. One of Sophie's first sentences was, "Daddy, it doesn't suck." She was pointing to her bottle. At the age of 3, she said, "Daddy, can I have a Porsche?" "Yes, sweetheart. I'll buy you a whole fleet of them." Being a father the second time was just as wonderful, if not more so. The last thing on my mind had been kids. I thought I would die with my freedom. Underneath that, of course, it was all about fear. I didn't want to run out on my kids when they were 6 or 7, the way my father had run out on me. I wanted to be there. I wanted my kids to know I would always be there for them, and I wanted them to respect me. Part of gaining that respect was explaining to them how Shannon and I had chosen to live and conduct ourselves as parents. My philosophy was simple. I always felt that in this predetermined world, you should take every opportunity to change things to suit you. If you don't like your name, pick another. If you want to straighten your hair, straighten it. If you can't stand where you're living, move. My kids have both Tweed and Simmons as their last names, but when they get older, they will have the chance to keep or change their names. Shannon and I also tried to clarify our arrangement. As soon as our children were old enough to understand, we explained that we weren't married and that we were together because we wanted to be. They accepted this, more or less. And where it confused them, we took pains to discuss it at great length. Both Nicholas and Sophie have had classmates and friends whose parents were separated or divorced, and Shannon pointed out to them that this was a painful situation, especially because it required breaking an oath. All in all, I have encouraged them to think of themselves as individuals. When you create a painting, it has to be original. Don't paint by numbers. All these metaphors are long-winded ways of saying something very simple. Trust yourself to be your own guide. As I write this book, Nicholas is 12, Sophie is 9. He didn't miss a day of school between 1st and 5th grade, and is in advanced studies in 6th grade, as well as having another year of perfect attendance. She constantly earns Best Student Awards. They are wonderful, loving children, and I would do anything for them. I don't know if life can get better, and they are a large part of why I feel this way. I can see the way they have changed my life every time I visit my mother's house. I'm an only child, remember, and for many years my mother's house was a shrine to me. You couldn't find a spot on the wall without a picture of me. Here's Jean eating in a high chair, there's Jean playing, there's Jean standing around doing nothing. Now I go over there, and if I'm lucky, I can find a few pictures of me pushed to the back of a table. The rest have been replaced by pictures of my kids. My mother has gone from being the world's most indulgent, wonderful, loving parent to being the world's most indulgent, wonderful, loving grandparent. Reason to Live, Face to Face with the Kiss Army, 1993 to 1995. When all the planets line up, you have a chance either to take advantage of it or else to miss the opportunity. I'd always been aware of our passionate fans, and in the mid-1990s they started holding Kiss conventions, in which they got together, dressed up in makeup, and celebrated the Kiss experience. Not only buying and trading memorabilia, but having discussions, showing concert films, and so on. It was a real gathering of the tribe. I read about these conventions and wished I could be there. They had a sense of purpose and togetherness that seemed very genuine, especially in light of all the excess and artificiality we had endured. And then it hit me. We could just hold our own Kiss conventions. Kiss had always been about the fans, and we had always been the quintessential American band, of the people, by the people, and for the people. Yet we had grown to the point that we were surrounded by bodyguards and had a moat around the stage. Why didn't we make ourselves available? Why didn't we sit up on that stage, answer questions from the heart, and interact with people who had made us who we were? I needed to find someone who could help me make this convention idea into a reality. I had produced 2 albums by a band named Black and Blue, and I went to their guitar player, Tommy Thayer, and sat him down for a heart-to-heart conversation. I told him that his band was not going to make it. I told him that in my estimation, he had come to a crossroads in his life, and that soon he was going to have to make a choice. He could go into the real world and get a real job, or else he could come work with me. He wanted to know what kind of job I was offering him. I said, I don't know. Every day I'll get up and I'll let you know what your job is going to be. And if you're going to say I don't do windows, you better tell me no now, because whatever has to be done, including getting the coffee, is what you'll do, or else don't do it. Tommy didn't even blink. He just rolled up his sleeves and said, okay, what do you want to do? Without any experience, Tommy and I started to research the possibility of hosting these conventions. The first thing that struck me was the problem of our liability. If we hosted a KISS convention, and if we had parking, and a guy cracked up his car, he might sue us. And if we served food and somebody got food poisoning, she might sue us. If we rented a concert hall and it caught on fire, or there was an accident, more lawsuits. So we needed a place where we could put up a suit-proof convention, a place where I didn't have to staff up and hire personnel to take care of parking, catering, and so forth. The answer seemed to be hotel ballrooms. I made an initial phone call or two just to see how it would work. It turned out that it was pretty reasonable to rent out a ballroom for 12 hours or so, assuming we let the hotel keep all the parking fees, the money from the food, and any receipts if the conventioneers decided to spend the night. I sent Tommy Thayer on a trip across the country, lining up the cities. At the same time, I personally sent out mailings to fans, especially those within small communities, so they could be part of the conventions. When the convention started, the crew was pretty small. Me and Paul, Tommy Thayer, Eric Singer, and Bruce Kulick. Tommy arranged with some other guys locally to put together a lot of the memorabilia that I had saved, plus the KISS outfits, and to display it all in a kind of KISS Hall of Fame, with 7-foot-high plexiglass enclosures. At the conventions, we had show and tell. We played an acoustic set. We answered questions from fans, and we answered them truthfully, which means that the answers weren't always happy ones. If a fan asked, "Is it true that Ace drinks?" my answer would be yes. If a fan asked, "Did Ace play on Flaming Youth?" my answer would be no. This was long before that Storyteller series on VH1, but that was the sense of it if you add in an extensive autograph session afterward. It was 12 hours solid with the fans. We did 23 cities total, and the very first one was in Los Angeles at a Hilton hotel. By this point, Peter Criss's daughter was in her teens. She'd never seen KISS in makeup, and had only heard about it from her father. She wanted to go to the LA convention. So Peter called a journalist and wanted to know if the journalist could arrange for him and his daughter to go to the convention. The journalist called me immediately, and I called Peter. "Peter," I said, "you don't have to ask somebody else. You're a part of the band's history. This should be your place, too. We'll send a limo to pick you up. You'll be treated like a king because you are. Whatever you want is yours." For a few years, I hadn't seen much of either Ace or Peter. Through the mid-1990s, I had worked on a number of side projects, producing acts like Black and Blue, Tommy Thayer's band, Wendy O. Williams of the Plasmatics, Keel, and Easy O, and sometimes I invited Peter and Ace on these projects. But I didn't have any real thoughts of bringing them back into KISS. Ace and Peter had become so crippled by their emotional problems and by various substances, they had become so diminished as human beings and as musicians, that they would have been an embarrassment. It's one thing to get together again in a room and trade old stories, but when you put the makeup back on and step up on that stage, how are you going to be convincing? Still, I thought Peter deserved his spot on stage at these conventions. There's a funny side note to this story. About 6 months earlier, Tom and Roseanne Arnold, they were together at that point, had called me to find out if I wanted to contribute to or somehow get involved in the Peter Criss Fund. They had read that Peter was down on his luck, that he was homeless and living under a bridge. I told them, don't pay attention to those stories, they're not true. It may be true that Peter is broke, but I don't think he's living under a bridge. They insisted that they had read this piece and heard the same news from others. 2 or 3 months after that, I was watching Phil Donahue's show, and the guest was none other than Peter Criss, talking about a guy who was living under a bridge and who bore a rough resemblance to Peter. One of the tabloids had either paid this guy or swallowed his story, and this trumped-up tale about Peter living under a bridge began to make the rounds. So that was how Peter reappeared on my radar. By this time, both Ace and Peter were relegated to playing clubs, and at one point, they decided to tour together as the Bad Boys of Rock. They were playing Kiss songs, but they couldn't use the Kiss logos or makeup. Peter would later tell me that being on tour with Ace was not easy, because Ace would continually be drunk or high, and because there was always a big discussion about who was going to headline. This was during their 1994 tour. I invited Peter to come down to the convention, and Eric Singer, God bless him, said, "You know what? You should ask him if he wants to come up when we do our acoustic set. Maybe he'll want to sing a song or two. I'm sure the fans would love it." When Eric said that, we all looked at each other and said, "Sure, why not?" Before the convention, we got together and rehearsed with Peter. He tried playing drums, but it was substandard. So Eric Singer decided to play the drums behind Peter, while Peter just got up on a stool and sang. As it turned out, it was a heartwarming experience. I looked across the stage and thought it was a real shame that Peter's other problems had prevented him from doing his best for the band and for himself, because the fans loved it. They were having so much fun, and so was I, to be honest. I wish we could have isolated the moment in time when we sang those 2 songs together. It was magic.